It's really interesting because it parlays into something else that I wanted to talk to Dr. Peterson about, which is your personality series and the difference between people on the left and people on the right, agreeableness, conscientiousness. Could you go into that a little bit? Because I was watching some of it, and it's just fascinating.
Okay, well, yeah, there's been a fair bit of work done among psychologists in the last about 15 years, really. It's not much older than that. Well, and it's only been 30 years, I would say, since we've really got a handle on the basic personality dimensions. And so I'll start with that. So if you look cross-culturally, you can identify 5 fundamental traits. You can argue about exactly how many there are, but 5 isn't a bad guess. The statistics allow you to extract out more, but you want to make it simple and comprehensive at the same time. So 5 seems to be a pretty good number. And so the first dimension is extroversion. And extroversion is a positive emotion dimension. And so you have a neurological system that's part of your central nervous system that mediates positive emotion. It's the system that drugs like cocaine affect directly. It's the system that is operating whenever you're doing anything that is moving you towards a valuable goal, for example. And you like having that system on. And extroverts have a very low threshold for activation of that system, or it's a more powerful system. It's not obvious which. And so extroverts are assertive, so they'll talk more in a group. You guys are all extroverted, obviously. And they're also enthusiastic, although those vary. Those two aspects, they're called, can vary slightly independently. And then there's neuroticism. Neuroticism is a negative emotion dimension. And people who are high in neuroticism feel higher levels of anxiety and emotional pain, which would include grief and shame and frustration and disappointment. And neurotic people are more likely to withdraw and avoid, and they're also more volatile, which means touchy, and likely to respond with a certain amount of defensive aggression. And women are higher in neuroticism than men by a fairly substantial margin, and that's not sociocultural, regardless of what the bloody social constructionists say, because the differences are biggest in Scandinavia, where they've done the most to flatten out the socioeconomic playing field between men and women. What happens is if you flatten out the socioeconomic playing field, the biological differences maximize. And that's well established. Yeah, I know, it's so...
Because there's a bit of science. We did the test. Here's the evidence.
Yeah, we did the test. The social constructionists were wrong. Period.
No, the sample size wasn't big enough?
I don't like the data. Let's do another test.
Yeah. Like, well, it's only 3 countries. Like, yeah, those are countries. Those are countries we're talking about. And yeah, the data is very, very clear. And so the next trait is agreeableness. And agreeable people, I think it's the primary maternal dimension. And agreeable people are polite and compassionate. And agreeableness is associated with political correctness. And you might think, well, they're not polite or compassionate. But what you have to understand is that compassionate people are very compassionate towards their in-group. But the out-group is a predator as far as they're concerned. And so it's like the social justice warrior types who are motivated by agreeableness are like mothers protecting their babies from snakes. And that's exactly how they act, which I think is also very comical, because almost all the PC authoritarian types, the radical leftists, they're all social constructionists. And here they are acting out their biology like robots, essentially. It's quite amusing.
Yeah. You almost want to stop and say, I noticed that like 15 of you out there hit someone today. How often do you strike people in your day-to-day lives? Really? So it's only when you're expressing this that you find that it's needed or necessary or that you feel justified to hit people. Okay, all right.
Yeah. Well, it's and I do really think that it's our research into political correctness indicated that both being female and being agreeable were contributors to the politically correct attitude, and that's quite interesting, because usually, if you look at sex differences in behavior, they're almost always accounted for by personality. But we found effects of being female and effects of being agreeable. And so the next trait is conscientiousness. And conscientious people are dutiful, they're industrious and orderly. And orderliness is quite a good predictor of conservative political belief. And it seems to be associated with disgust sensitivity. And that seems to be associated with morality of purity. So it's something that Jonathan Haidt has talked a lot about. And so that's very cool. And it was very interesting to our lab was did a lot of work on the relationship between orderliness and disgust sensitivity.
What does that mean, a morality of purity?
Well, imagine that conservatives are much more convinced of the necessity of regulating your moral behavior, say, with regards to such things as sexuality. And some of that is rooted in the contamination avoidance. That would be a good way to put it. I can tell you a really interesting study that's relevant to this. It's so cool. This should have been like headline news around the world, this study. It was about 3 years ago. But people were looking at the relationship between disgust sensitivity and authoritarianism. And so these people went and did a study looking at the prevalence of infectious diseases within a country and also between countries. And it turns out that the correlation between the prevalence of infectious diseases and totalitarian individual views was about 0.6, which is a correlation, the magnitude of which you never see in the social sciences.
It suggests causation.
It certainly
at that
does.
point.
It certainly does.
That's fascinating, because what you have is a group of people who have been, and it's ingrained in them, maybe just through their lives or maybe genetically, that like there's a big fear of the other here. The other for them might be dirty water, it might be street gangs, but because of that, that's ingrained in them, and they're much more likely to feel that way about other outside forces.
Well, and I think it can be triggered. It can be triggered pretty easily. Like it can be triggered by epidemic, and I mean, you saw some of that in the response to AIDS in North America, but you also saw the reason for that existence of that disgust sensitivity with the rise of AIDS, because AIDS was a virus that mutated to take advantage of promiscuity. And so the thing about disgust sensitivity is you can't just get rid of it, because it actually turns out that lots of things that disgust you can kill you if you are exposed to them. And so it's not a simple... Now, one of the things it does suggest, though, is if you wanted to decrease the degree to which people were authoritarian around the world, a public health policy might be the best way to do it. And who would have guessed that, You go out and eradicate the infectious diseases, people get a lot more liberal and a lot more tolerant. So, I mean, that's why we have science, right? Because it tells you things you'd never guess at. And then the last dimension is openness. And openness is a creativity dimension, basically. And it's associated to some degree with intelligence, with psychometric intelligence. And the biggest difference between liberals and conservatives is that conservatives are low in openness. And most of that isn't mediated by intelligence, by the way. But conservatives tend to be less creative and more conscientious. And so that makes them really good managers and administrators, lawyers, conservative businessmen, in the more traditional sense. They're very good at running things, but they're not very good at originating them. It's the creative types, the liberal types, that start businesses, and it's the conservative types that run them, which is also very cool, because it shows you that we need each other. So, which we do, because, the low conscientious liberals are more likely to take a risk and go off on a wild tangent. And they're going to bloody well fail catastrophically most of the time.
If they didn't need each other, we wouldn't have evolved that way. I would imagine that people with those two mindsets have been combining those two parts of themselves for eons.
Yeah, well, you can think about, the social world as containing niches that people fit in. And one niche is the entrepreneurial creative niche, and so there's evolution towards that niche, and the other one is the managerial administrative traditional niche. Because, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to do things the way everyone else does them if everything's working, right? That's the conservative issue. But it also makes a lot of sense to do something new if things aren't working, and that's a different way of adapting successfully to the world. So what's the upshot of all this? Well, the first is that these temperaments, these traits, act in some sense as filters in the world. And so it isn't exactly that people whose political attitudes differ have different opinions, although they do. It's that they see the world differently. They literally see it differently, and they filter the facts differently. And so I think it might make people more politically tolerant if they actually understood that the person across the ideological divide was a different sort of being than them. There's a good argument for diversity. How about that? How about real diversity? Because the racial diversity argument really bugs me, and I can tell you why. Because it's predicated on the idea that there's more difference between people of different races than there is differences between people within the same race. And that's wrong.
Yep.
Technically, factually, not only is it incorrect, it's really seriously incorrect. Even with men and women, there are more differences within women and within men than there are between men and women on average.
I feel to me, the diversity thing is the criticism that's sunk home with me is the idea that they want equality of outcome instead of equality of opportunity. And I hear that and I'm like, right, that is so correct. So my father,
that's the equity argument.
My father, well, he's passed now, but he was a fireman, and through his whole career, he had to struggle with diversity requirements. And it was just known, I'll say it bluntly, white guys needed higher test scores. If you're a white guy, you typically had to finish in the top 1 to 3 scores to get promoted. And then if you're a black guy, you just had to finish in the top 1 to 3 amongst black people, which would tend to be in the teens and 20s overall. And he found this really frustrating. He wasn't particularly academically gifted, but it was always scores easily well enough to get promoted if I was black, but because I'm white, I'm burning, busting my butt.
There was a big to-do about that in the news in the U.S., affirmative action coming under kind of, critique. And it is more nefarious than you think. When you think about it, just real quick, it's easy to go, good idea, makes me feel good, nice. But really, it's kind of like you're taking people who otherwise could be really successful at a middling university and shoehorning them into the top universities just by virtue of gender or race or whatever. And then they underperform, of course, and it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like you did this by trying to pretend that just because they have that's something different between their legs or a different color skin that they're, worthy of that merit. No, it's really just kind of a roundabout and really condescending, by the way. To just go and be like, black people, women, none of them can succeed unless we give them an edge up. They obviously can't compete with white guys in the free market, so we got to make special little allowances. And
do you remember that scene in G.I. Jane where Demi Moore is trying to become the first Navy SEAL or whatever, and in the obstacle course they have a box. You have to climb one of those vertical walls that a 6-foot-tall man can jump, grab with his fingertips, pull himself up, and muscle himself over, but there was a step there for her. And she was like, fuck that step. I feel like there are steps there for a lot of people. And if I were one of those people, I would say, fuck that step. Fuck that step. This is what you think of me? You think I need this? It seems so racist, so awful if I'm that individual. So it really makes me take to heart what you say often about how just because you are a member of group A or B, you're not automatically a spokesperson for them. Quite the opposite. You might be the only member of that group that feels that way.
Yeah, well, the reason that we have elections is so that we can identify genuine representatives. And I just can't believe that, in Ontario, for example, the premier met with the leaders of Black Lives Matter. It's well, what the hell? It's so somebody makes this group predicated on their racial identity, claims oppression, but worse, claims to be a spokesperson for that entire race, and our elected officials treat them as if they're valid representatives, just by virtue of their what would you call it, exploitation of their skin color. It's completely crazy, But it's part and parcel of the times that we live in, I'm afraid. So, but it's been very interesting. I mean, the orderliness thing really, really struck me hard, especially when we started to associate that with disgust sensitivity, because I had been reading Hitler's Table Talk while I was doing some of this research, and Hitler's Table Talk was a collection of his speeches, spontaneous utterances at dinner time for 3 years, I think from 1939 to 1942. And, one of the things you hear about theories about what motivates the radical right is fear of the other. And it's a powerful theory, except that it doesn't seem to be borne out by certain facts. So, for example, if conservatives are more fearful, they should be more neurotic on the big 5 personality scales. But in fact, they're not. They're actually slightly less neurotic. The most neurotic political types are actually liberal men. If
you go on Twitter, that's not surprising.
Yeah, well, but so the conservatives don't seem to be high in negative emotion. In fact, overall, their life satisfaction is higher than that of liberals. And so it doesn't look like it's fear of the other that's motivating, say, that stay in your box right-wing ideology. But disgust, that's a whole different thing. And, when I was reading Hitler's Table Talk and starting to think about disgust, which again, Jonathan Haidt has studied a lot, the disgust language among the disgust language was absolutely pervasive in Hitler's discussions of the Jews and the Gypsies, for example. All the people that he went after, he treated them like they were contaminants, and they were associated with rats and insects and all of that. And he used the same biochemical means to combat all of them, but it was disgust, eh? So that was really interesting and ominous.
I think that's telling as to it. I think that really supports your argument here. The fact that when Hitler starts his cleaning of Germany, he starts low, right? The rats, the disease. I'm sure there were sanitation programs that were very beneficial to the German people. Then he's like, oh, Zyklon A, this incredibly powerful gas that a Jewish man had invented, just eradicates all the pestilence inside German factories. They become much cleaner places. It's not much longer, though, until he says, take that smell out of that Zyklon A. If it were, let's call it Zyklon B, nobody can smell it, and we'll use that on the other rats that we have. We'll use that on and that's what they used on the Jews. It's really
terrifying, too, when I thought, when I associated it with those other studies that were showing that the prevalence of infectious disease was a predictor of authoritarian attitudes, because, you know, it shows how deeply rooted this is in our biology, and that's frightening, right? And it's even more frightening because it's rooted there for a reason, you know. And it is frequently the case that the other is a source of contamination. So when the Europeans came to North America, you know, the Europeans had been in these filthy cities, packed together in terrible epidemic conditions, and millions died. But we evolved a substantial immunity against many of those infectious diseases. The Spaniards came to Central America, and, you know, 95% of the natives died across North and South America, just in waves, right? Measles, mumps, smallpox, chickenpox, no immunity whatsoever. There were almost no diseases in the New World. And so it almost wiped out the entire population of the Western Hemisphere. So it's no wonder we're leery of strangers, you know, like, now, of course, the counter argument is, yeah, well, what about all the cool things and the trade and the expansion of knowledge? And of course, that's the liberal attitude, and it's absolutely correct. What about all those things? It's wonderful, but the problem is you got a devil on both sides. So it's a really difficult thing to contend with.